Last month you noticed something strange on your way home. A bird kept appearing near you, first on a streetlight, then outside the store. Then again near your car, silent every time, no sudden movement, just watching. Following at a distance like it already knew where you were going next. At first you ignored it. Birds fly everywhere. They land near people constantly. But then it happened again the next day. Different location, same feeling, you turn a corner. And there it is again, quiet, almost waiting. And that's when the experience stops feeling random, because birds usually move unpredictably. But when the same bird seems to follow you from place to place without making a sound, your brain reacts differently. It starts paying attention. Here's what most people don't realize: silence changes how humans interpret behavior. Loud movement feels harmless. Quiet repetition feels intentional. And once your mind labels something as intentional, it becomes difficult to ignore. That's why experiences like this stay with people for years. But that's not the real reason this feels unsettling. The real reason is movement. Because the bird isn't stay in one place. It appears again somewhere new. Different street, different tree, different moment of your day. And every time you notice it, your brain starts asking the same question. How is it here again? This is where it gets interesting. Scientifically, some birds actually do track human movement patterns. Ravens recognize routines. Urban birds learn schedules surprisingly fast. If someone regularly walks the same route, visits the same places, or leaves food nearby even unintentionally, birds begin associating that person with familiarity and safety. But emotionally, that explanation doesn't fully remove the feeling, it just appears. And the human brain reacts strongly to repeated silent presence. Throughout history, humans survived by noticing patterns in movement around them. Repeated observation from an animal could signal danger, environmental change, or hidden awareness nearby. So even today, your nervous system automatically reacts when something keeps reappearing around you without obvious explanation, especially in silence. The first thing people notice is timing. The bird appears during emotionally charged moments. Walking home after a stressful, sitting alone outside, leaving work exhausted, standing quietly somewhere lost in thought. Your brain begins linking the experiences together. Psychologists call this emotional anchoring, external emotional states. So later, even remembering the bird brings back the feeling of that moment in your life. But that's not the deepest part of this. The deeper part is familiarity. Because eventually, people stop being surprised by the bird. Instead, they start looking for it. Without realizing it, they glance toward rooftop lots, fence posts. And when the bird appears again, there's a strange sense of recognition changes psychologically. The bird stops feeling like random wildlife. It becomes presence, predictable presence. And the human brain forms attachments to predictable presence faster than most people realize. This is where it gets even more interesting. Birds themselves are incredibly observant creatures, movement constantly. They remember feeding locations, human habits, safe areas, and repeated environmental patterns. Some birds even follow humans unintentionally simply because the person repeatedly enters their territory or routine, which means the bird may not actually be following you personally. It may be following familiarity. But emotionally, humans interpret repeated familiarity as attention changes everything. Here's what most people don't realize: humans are deeply sensitive to being observed. Even subtle observation triggers subconscious awareness systems inside the brain. That instinct helped humans survive for thousands of years. So when the same silent bird repeatedly appears near you, part of your brain automatically enters monitoring mode. That's why the experience feels heavier than it logically should, even when you know it's probably harmless. The second thing people notice is eye contact. Casual glance. The bird stares longer than expected, sometimes tilts its head slightly, sometimes freezes completely when you notice it looking at you. And strangely, that stillness makes the moment feel more personal, because most avoid sustained attention toward humans, but certain birds don't. Crows especially study faces carefully. Ravens analyze behavior patterns. Smaller birds often pause to assess movement before deciding whether someone is safe. And once your brain notices repeated eye contact from the same silent bird, the experience becomes emotionally difficult to dismiss. This is where psychology becomes important again. Humans naturally anthropomorphize repeated non-threatening behavior. In simple terms, the brain assigns intention, personality, and meaning to things that consistently interact with us, especially during periods of loneliness, stress, or emotional uncertainty. So the bird slowly becomes more than a bird in the mind. It becomes symbolic, not because it necessarily means something supernatural, but because the brain transforms repetition into narrative automatically. And honestly, humans need narratives, make uncertainty easier to tolerate. The third thing people notice is silence. The bird rarely makes sound, no loud calls, no warning noises, no aggressive behavior. Sometimes it simply lands nearby, watches quietly for a few moments, then leaves again. And strangely, the silence makes the experience feel more intense, because silence forces attention. When something remains quiet, your brain fills the silence with interpretation, meaning. And once imagination enters the experience, ordinary moments begin feeling strangely profound. Here's what most people don't realize: humans are uncomfortable with unexplained stillness. In modern life, everything moves constantly: notifications, traffic, comes, noise everywhere. So when a silent bird repeatedly enters your awareness without obvious purpose, it interrupts automatic thinking, reflect. And once something interrupts automatic living, your mind assigns importance to it. That's why people remember these experiences for years afterward. Not because the bird necessarily meant something extraordinary, but because it forced awareness. The fourth thing becomes harder to explain logically. Sometimes the bird appears in completely unexpected places. You leave your neighborhood, drive across town, sit somewhere unfamiliar, and somehow later that day you notice a similar bird nearby again. Now realistically, it may not even be the same bird, but your brother. Ain doesn't experience it that way. Because once humans become emotionally aware of a pattern, selective attention strengthens dramatically. You begin noticing similar details more often than before. Psychologists call this frequency illusion. Once something enters your awareness emotionally, your brain suddenly detects it everywhere, and that creates the feeling that the bird is continuing to follow you. But that's not the real reason people become disturbed by the experience. The real reason is repetition without closure. The bird never explains itself, it never approaches direct, never leaves obvious evidence, never behaves dramatically enough to fully confirm meaning. It simply appears again and again, quietly entering the edges of your awareness, and uncertainty creates obsession faster than certainty ever could. This is where it gets unsettling for many people. Eventually, some people begin changing their behavior slightly because of the bird. They slow down more often, look upward more frequently, longer outside, think more deeply during walk, notice their surroundings differently. In a strange way, the bird becomes a trigger for awareness itself. Air possesses mythical power, but because repetition changes perception, and once perception changes, daily life feels different, and people rarely admit is this. Sometimes they start silently talking to the bird, not necessarily out loud. Questions, observations, tiny emotional reactions. And while that sounds strange, psychology explains it perfectly. Humans naturally form emotional bonds with familiar, non-threatening presence, especially when that presence appears consistently during emotionally meaningful periods of life. The bird becomes routine, creates even silent routine. That's why some people feel genuinely disappointed when the bird suddenly stops appearing forever. Because now the absence feels noticeable too. That reveals something important about human nature. Humans don't just attach emotionally to people, they attach emotionally to repeated experiences. The sixth thing people notice is emotional timing. Many periods of transition, happening during periods of transition, breakups, burnout, loneliness, major decisions, identity changes, moments where life already feels uncertain and why. And because the bird keeps appearing during those emotionally charged periods, the mind fuses the two together permanently. So years later, people don't just remember the bird, they remember who they were when it appeared. And maybe that's why these experiences stay so vivid, because the bird accidentally became part of a personal chapter in their life story. This is where it gets interesting again. Across different cultures throughout history, birds were often seen as messengers or symbols, but most people misunderstand why. It wasn't because ancient people believed birds literally carried magical secrets. It was because birds appeared during moments humans became more emotionally observant. The symbol came after the emotional experience, and that emotional experience still exists today. Because deep down, humans constantly search for meaning and repeated attention from the outside world, especially during moments where they feel emotionally disconnected from themselves. But now comes the final point. Eventually, many people stop fearing the bird entirely. Instead, they begin appreciating it. The same silent presence that once felt eerie becomes grounding. And that shift reveals something surprisingly human. Sometimes what unsettles us first is simply consistency. We live surrounded by noise, distraction, and constant unpredictability. So when something silent repeatedly appears beside us without demanding anything, it feels unnatural at first. But over time, the repeated presence becomes calming and steady. Never spoke, never forced meaning onto you. It simply appeared, again and again. And maybe that's why experiences like this stay with people long after the bird disappears. Because deep down, humans crave moments that interrupt automatic living. Moments that pull them out of distraction long enough to notice their own thoughts again. So if a bird ever follows you from place to place without making a sound, maybe the real meaning isn't hidden inside the bird itself. Maybe it's hidden inside what the experience awakened inside you: the awareness, the reflection, the strange stillness you suddenly started noticing in your own life. And maybe that's why these moments feel impossible to fully explain afterward. Not because something supernatural happened, but because for a brief period of time, something outside you quietly changed the way you paid attention to yourself. And honestly, that can affect a person more deeply than they expect. So next time a silent bird appears near you again and again in places it shouldn't logically be, Don't rush to explain it away immediately. Just pause for a second. Okay. Notice how the experience changes the way you think. Notice what emotions appear when you see it again, because sometimes the strangest experiences become important not because of what they're, but because of what they quietly awaken inside you. And if something like this has ever happened to you before, if a silent bird seemed to follow you through a strange period in your life, share your story below. Because the unsettling part is realizing you may not be the only one who noticed.